This is a story of the rich getting richer,
while the poor are now poorer.
Polls show most Americans believe that the poor are getting poorer. I understand why they think that. We hear it all the time.
This rich getting richer thing and the poor getting poor.
The rich get richer, the poor get poorer.
That last man was the head of the NRA. We hear this myth from the left and the right. But what's the truth? What's the big picture? Economics professor Abby Blanco keeps track of the data. What's the truth?
So wages look relatively flat. If you look at the data that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has collected.
And we have a graph of that we can put up.
If you look at the data they've collected since 1964, wages look relatively flat for most Americans. Not for the rich,
not for the top 1%.
Not for the rich, but we're missing the big picture. What are the poorest people in the U.S. able to consume today? So we can look at things like airline travel or cell phones, computers, cars, even things like living space. And what we see is that the poor today spend much less of their income on these kinds of items than they did before, and they're much more accessible to people today, even though they were once exclusively reserved for only the wealthiest Americans.
So why doesn't that show up on these graphs from the government? And you say that it's relatively flat, but to be exact, the poorest people and middle-income people have gained also. The rich got absurdly rich and the poor did a little better.
It's not true at all. So we can think about the economy or wealth like a pizza. And people typically operate under the assumption that if I get a bigger piece of pizza, you have to get a smaller one. But that's not how wealth works. If the economy is growing and getting larger and larger, even though the piece of wealth that an individual is getting is smaller, it could be bigger overall. So indeed, we see that the poor and Americans in the middle income bracket are also doing much better.
One reason people think the poor are doing worse is that they think it's a zero-sum game. But it is made. It's not like Bill Gates took a big piece of the pie so we have less. He baked a million new pies.
Right. So we create new kinds of wealth all the time. It's not just a sunny side of the street for the wealthiest Americans, but it's relatively sunny for the poorest Americans as well.
But Donald Trump says it's a zero-sum game. If we trade, if China wins, we lose.
The trade argument is not just wrong, it's spectacularly wrong. NAFTA's created 34 million jobs in the United States, and an additional 6 million jobs are tied directly to Mexican industry alone.
How? How does it create jobs?
So it creates jobs in ways that sometimes are hard to see. So we see things like people creating new businesses, people demanding new kinds of items and innovation, things which weren't there before, which now become available. Econ 101 tells us that when countries can trade those things that they're really good at making, that it increases wealth overall. It's what economists refer to as comparative advantage. So comparative advantage says we should make those things that it's cheap for us to make, and we should buy from other people the things that it's expensive for us to make. So we see that in the US, we're really good at making service products. We're very good at making automobiles. We're good at making medicines and things like that. But it's relatively expensive for us to produce things like clothing and other textiles.
Some people do lose from trade. People lose jobs.
Some people are knocked out of the jobs that they're currently in. And certainly we can talk about and be concerned about those people who are losing their jobs as a result of trade, talk about different ways that we might make those transitions easier. But trade overall is a remarkably positive game for all parties involved.
And the UN says 1 billion people are no longer miserably poor, largely because of this trade that Trump condemns.
Trade has lifted millions of people out of poverty, particularly over the last 30 years. We now see the lowest number of people living in absolute poverty that's under $2 a day. It's the lowest it's ever been in recorded human history, and that is directly related to trade.
To the much vilified trade and globalization. Thank you, Abby Blanco.